Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Holmes as he uncovers a puzzle that wasn't written on paper, whispered in the dark, or left in plain sight. It was etched on the blades of a fan, turning silently above everyone's head. Stay with me till the end, because the answer to this riddle isn't just clever, it's shocking. And before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a mystery. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing detectives from all around the world join in. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was a morning like any other in Baker Street, marked by the persistent drizzle against the glass and the low rumble of distant wheels echoing from Oxford Street. I had just returned from an early visit to Bart's hospital and was peeling off my damp gloves when the sharp clang of the bell at 221 B's front door stirred the landlady. Below, Mrs. Hudson's hurried steps echoed on the stairs before the soft murmur of voices floated upward, followed moments later by the opening of our sitting room door. A visitor. "Watson," said Holmes, who hadn't once looked up from the newspaper sprawled across his lap. A man in some distress, judging by the tremble in his gait and the haste of his knock. "From the east, I should imagine. The air smells of Blackwall docks." I barely had time to take my seat before the door opened wider to admit a man of perhaps 50, narrow of face, eyes darting behind thick spectacles, and drenched from head to foot. His hands trembled visibly as he removed his hat and looked about uncertainly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, in a voice taut with unease. Holmes rose with a courteous nod. "You are expected, though we've yet to be formally introduced. Please, take the armchair near the fire." "I am Lionel Channing," he said, settling into the chair with visible relief. "Superintendent of Marbury House in Surrey. Or rather I was, until last night's disaster." Holmes raised an eyebrow and flicked a glance at me. "Disaster, Mr. Channing? Pray, elaborate." Channing rubbed at his temples as if to compose himself. "It's murder, Mr. Holmes. But not just any murder, impossible one. I had to come to you directly. Scotland Yard is already on the premises, but they are confounded." "You intrigued me," Holmes said, leaning forward. "Impossible murders are my preferred genre." Channing hesitated, as though uncertain how to begin. "The victim is Mr. Gareth Willoughby, the retired antiquities dealer. He was found dead, stabbed in his locked study late last evening." Holmes made a soft sound in his throat. "A locked room affair. We've had a few of those before, Watson." I nodded. "Indeed." Channing shook his head quickly. "It is far stranger than that, sir. The room was not merely locked, it was bolted from the inside. The windows are barred with iron latticework. There is no trapdoor, no secret panel, no second entrance. And most baffling of all, ... He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the words themselves would betray reason. Double quotes, ... The murder weaponer, small antique dagger, was found embedded in the ceiling fan, still rotating." Holmes's eyes sparked with sudden interest. "Embedded, you say?" "Yes, as though it had been thrown or launched with such force that it pierced the wooden blade and stopped the fan entirely." Yet the victim was stabbed, Holmes clarified. Channing gave a miserable nod. In the heart, a single clean wound, no blood spatter, no signs of struggle. He was seated upright at his desk when discovered. The dagger's twin was displayed behind glass in the same room, both Sumerian, ceremonial, and highly valuable. Holmes had now risen, his fingers steepled. Fascinating. And you say the fan was in motion when the body was discovered? Yes, the servant who found him, a young woman named Edith Troswares. She saw the fan slowing down, the dagger in place. Holmes paced to the window and stared out into the rain. So we have a locked study, a murdered man who appears to have been struck through the heart, and the weapon somehow embedded in a rotating ceiling fan. Exactly, sir. Was the room disarranged in any way? Holmes asked, without turning. No, immaculate. Mr. Willoughby was extremely precise in his habits. Every paper aligned, every artifact in its place. That was his pride. And you say Scotland Yard is already investigating? Channing hesitated. Yes, Inspector Gregson arrived with a constable this morning. But I overheard him say it's as if the killer vanished into smoke. A wry smile touched Holmes's lips. Gregson is an honest man, but not given to imaginative leaps. He turned back to Channing. And your reason for coming to me? Channing's voice cracked slightly. Because if Gareth Willoughby was killed by a man, then that man must be invisible or else capable of passing through iron and wood. I can think of no other explanation. The staff is terrified. Some whisper of ancient curses. But I must know the truth. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a quiet fire. A murder committed in a sealed room, the weapon appearing to fall from above, yet no signs of intrusion or escape. It is, as you say, impossible. He turned to me. Watson, pack your bag. We depart for Marbury House within the hour. And what of the storm? I asked, noting the gray churn outside the window. It is, I suspect, Holmes said, slipping into his greatcoat. The perfect weather for the unraveling of impossible things. Chapter 2. The arrival at Marbury House. The journey to Surrey was a sodden one. Our carriage jostled by wind and soaked by the steady downpour that had not abated since morning. Holmes, as was his habit, sank into a state of silent concentration for the duration. His gaze fixed somewhere beyond the rain-streaked window, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. I had long since learned not to interrupt these spells of introspection, though I admit to a growing unease as the road twisted farther from the bustle of London into the remote woodland outskirts. Marbury House came into view just as the sky darkened further with the promise of a storm. It was a great Tudor structure, its black timbered facade rising somberly from a bed of yellowing grass and skeletal hedgerows. A twisted iron gate marked the entrance, flanked by moss-covered pillars, each crowned with a grotesque gargoyle whose hollow eyes watched our approach with disquieting permanence. Superintendent Channing was waiting beneath the shelter of the arched portico, wrapped in a thick woolen coat. As we alighted, he raised a hand in silent greeting, his expression pinched with worry. The yard is inside, he murmured as we joined him beneath the stone arch. Gregson and his men. They've taken statements, but their tone makes it clear they believe it all superstition and misdirection. Though how they reconcile that with the facts, ... He trailed off, shaking his head. Holmes gave a nod and brushed the rain from his coat. They do their best with the tools at hand. Now, Mr. Channing, I should like to be shown to the scene at once. Watson will remain at my side. We passed through heavy oak doors into a hall of ancient grandeur. The interior was dim despite the hour, for the thick curtains had been drawn tightly shut. Portraits of grim ancestors lined the corridor, their cracked oil faces lit only by flickering gas lamps. I found the atmosphere oppressive, though Holmes walked briskly, his gaze already scanning corners, floorboards, and sconces with silent calculation. "The study is this way," Channing said, leading us toward a carved door at the far end. "It remains just as it was found." Inside, the air was cold and stale, touched by a faint metallic temps. I stepped cautiously into the room, noting the dark paneled walls, the heavy leather-bound volumes lining the shelves, and the imposing desk that stood at the center. Like an altar of some forgotten rite, Holmes moved ahead and halted beneath the ornate ceiling fan. It was not running now, though its wooden blades stretched out like outstretched fingers. Lodged in one of them, unmistakable and grotesque in its defiance of logic, was the bleeda narrow Sumerian dagger, its handle blackened with age, the blade itself crusted faintly with dried blood. Holmes' eyes rose to it at once. "No one has disturbed this." "Not a soul," Channing replied. Inspector Gregson took one look and declared it unexplainable by common means. Holmes gave a soft hum and stepped forward. "You see, Watson, what strikes one first is not the dagger's presence, but the dagger's position. Consider the height. Even with considerable force, one would need an angle of approach from below to embed it there. And yet the wound was in the heart." I frowned. "You mean the dagger couldn't have come from the ceiling fan?" "Precisely. Or rather, if it did, it could not have struck the man while he was seated here." Holmes circled the desk slowly. "There are only 3 chairs in the room. One behind the desk where the victim was found, another by the hearth, and a third by the window. None are directly beneath the fan's center. The late Mr. Willoughby's desk remained untouched. On it sat an assortment of items, an inkwell, a blotter, several sealed envelopes, and a crystal ashtray, half full with gray remnants. But no sign of a struggle, no overturned chair or spilled glass." Holmes knelt to examine the floor, then rose swiftly and moved to the barred window. He tested the iron with a brief tug. "Solid, and the lock, Watson." I inspected it. "Latched tightly from the inside." Holmes nodded and returned to the body's reported position, gesturing to the empty chair behind the desk. "According to you, Channing, he was seated upright, as if asleep." "Yes, with no expression of pain or surprise, merely ... lifeless." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Which suggests possibly that death was instant, one clean strike." At that moment, the door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped in with the careful self-importance of a man who often found himself a step behind Holmes and knew it. Inspector Tobias Gregson, ruddy-cheeked and windblown, doffed his bowler and offered us a stiff nod. "Holmes, doctor. I wondered when you'd show your face here." "Gregson," Holmes replied without looking up. "I presume you've already concluded. The fan was the murder weapon, and are now seeking a man with superhuman aim or the gift of levitation." Gregson scowled. "I'm open to explanation, but I've seen no evidence of anyone leaving this room once it was locked. The key was still inside the victim's pocket, the bolt drawn. No marks on the carpet, no prints on the handle, no noise, I asked. No one heard a struggle or a scream. None. Miss Trotha. That was at 7:30. Says he was alone all afternoon. Holmes turned sharply. Miss Edith Trop. I'd like to speak with her, alone. Gregson opened his mouth to object, then thought better of it. She's shaken, but she'll talk. I'll send her in. As Gregson departed, Holmes returned to studying the room. There's something too symmetrical here, he murmured. A neatness that offends my instincts. I followed his gaze. You think the scene was staged? I don't know yet, Holmes replied, his tone unusually quiet. But if so, it was staged by someone with a theatrical hand, an eye for the dramatic. A knock on the door drew our attention. A young woman stepped in hesitantly, pale, thin, with dark eyes that spoke of restless nights. Miss Edith Trop curtsied awkwardly and stood by the doorframe. Holmes offered her a slight nod. Come in, Miss Trop, please. I have only a few questions. And as the rain tapped more insistently against the windowpane, the investigation began in earnest. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. Miss Edith Trop stood before us, wringing her hands in the folds of her dark skirt, her gaze darting from Holmes to the blade above, like a bird eyeing a hawk. She could not have been more than 20, with pale skin, uncombed hair pinned hurriedly back, and an air of weariness that seemed to cling to her like mist. Please sit, Holmes said gently, gesturing to the empty chair beside the hearth. We won't keep you long. She perched nervously on the edge of the seat, twisting the hem of her sleeve. You were the first to discover Mr. Willoughby's body, Holmes began. Yes, sir, she said in a soft voice. I brought him his tea tray just after 7:30. He hadn't rung for it, which was strange, because he always did. Like clockwork, he hated delays. And what did you see when you entered? The door was locked from the inside, sir. I knocked, but he didn't answer. I called out, nothing. I thought perhaps he was asleep, so I went to Mr. Channing, who opened the door, Holmes asked. Mr. Channing did, with the spare key from the steward's cabinet. When we entered, he was already gone, sitting there just like he was reading. Did anything seem out of place to you? Holmes asked. She looked up, startled. Well, no, sir. Not really. His desk was tidy, as always. The windows were latched, and the fire had gone out. I didn't notice the thing in the fan right away. But you did notice it eventually. Yes, I was standing here. She pointed toward the rug. I saw something shining up there. It was still spinning, slowly. I remember the sound it was creaking, like the motor was trying to turn but couldn't. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved past her, returning to the desk. He motioned for me to follow. Watson, look here, he murmured, indicating a neat stack of envelopes. They were unsealed and bore the neat, looping hand of the deceased. 5 letters, all half finished. The topmost begins mid-sentence. He turned it gently and read aloud. And while the matter remains unresolved, I shall not part with the artifact. It is too dangerous. Holmes tapped the page lightly, curious. To whom was this written? He flipped the page. The name on the intended address read simply, T. Harker, Bloomsbury. Do you recognize the name? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. But the language implies likely over an object, an artifact. He scanned the shelf behind the desk. Channing said the victim was a collector of antiquities. His life's work, Miss Trow added quietly. He spent hours in this room, cataloging them. He had hundreds. Some say he was obsessed. Obsessions often make enemies, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. Miss Tropp, who had access to this room? Only Mr. Willoughby, sir. And Mr. Channing had a spare key in case of emergencies. No one else. Holmes turned and surveyed the perimeter of the study again. His steps were slow, methodical. I saw him pause by the bookshelf, his fingers brushing the edge of a bronze figurine shaped like a winged bull. "Tell me," he said, without turning, "was anything taken?" Miss Tropp hesitated. I don't know, sir. Mr. Willoughby was very particular. If something had been moved, he'd have known. But you wouldn't necessarily notice it. She nodded quickly. No, sir. I dusted only what he allowed me to touch. Holmes crouched by the fireplace next, examining the ashes and the grate. "Watson," he murmured, "do you see what I see?" I stepped closer. Among the cinders, something glinted faintly, a warped metal sliver, thin and half-melted. "A fragment," Holmes murmured. "Perhaps from a locket or amulet. The fire was not recently lit. I'd wager it was burned deliberately." He slipped the fragment into a handkerchief and stood. "Thank you, Miss Trow," he said. "You've been most helpful. One final question. Did anyone visit Mr. Willoughby in the past few days? Someone from outside?" Her eyes shifted slightly. "Yes, sir. A man came 2 nights ago. I let him in myself. Mr. Willoughby was expecting him." "Did you catch a name?" "No, sir. But he had an accent. French, maybe." "He didn't stay long. Less than half an hour. He looked angry when he left, pale and red-eyed, like he'd been crying." Describe him, she thought. Mid-30s, thin, sharp features. He wore gloves and a black coat. His hands shook when he handed me his card, but I don't remember the name. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And the card?" "Mr. Willoughby took it right away. I never saw it again." "Thank you," Holmes said. "That will be all for now." She stood, bobbed her head, and retreated with the door closing softly behind her. I turned to Holmes. "You're thinking this visitor, whatever he was, may be connected to the letter?" "Possibly. It is too soon to say. But the presence of a stranger, emotional and possibly distressed, visiting just days before a man is found murdered in a sealed room with a dagger from his collection embedded above his head, strikes me as a pattern worth tracing." Holmes returned to the desk and retrieved the other letters, scanning them. "Here's another, addressed to a solicitor," he muttered. "Mentions a change in his will. Recent. What sort of change?" Holmes read, "To include the artifact in question among the primary holdings designated for preservation. It must not be sold, especially not to him." Just him, I frowned. Who was he so concerned about? And what was this artifact? Holmes looked up at the dagger above. "The one in the fan has a twin." That much Channing confirmed. But what if there was a third, the one he considered dangerous? The one burned in that hearth. My blood ran cold. "You believe it was destroyed deliberately?" Holmes folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Yes, to conceal it. Or perhaps to protect others from it." He turned to the door, his eyes sharp with resolve. "Come, Watson. We must speak to Channing again. There are shadows in this house. and I intend to shine a light on them. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. We found Mr. Channing in the drawing room, standing rigidly near the window, as if carved from the same dark oak that trimmed the house. He turned as we entered, his brow deeply furrowed, the lines about his mouth even more pronounced than before. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a faint nod, "has the maid provided any useful details?" "Indeed," Holmes replied, brushing rainwater from his coat sleeve. "Enough to raise new questions and resurrect old ones. I'd like a list of everyone who resides in this house or was here on the day of the murder, staff and visitors alike." Channing gave a brief nod. "There are 5 household staff: Edith Tropp, the maid; Mrs. Veal, the cook; Mr. Benso, the groundskeeper; and young Henry, the stable boy. Mr. Willoughby rarely entertained guests, but we had one recent visitor, a foreign gentleman whose name was unknown. He was shown in by Edith and left before nightfall." "Yes, we've heard of him," Holmes replied. "And the staff, where are they now?" "In their quarters or about their duties," Channing said. "The yard has interviewed them. They've been told not to leave." "I'll speak with them myself," Holmes said. "Please gather them in the parlor." Channing hesitated. "Do you suspect one of them?" "I suspect someone, Mr. Channing," Holmes replied, "and I intend to separate truth from convenience." Within the half hour, the staff assembled under the watchful eyes of Holmes and me. The parlor was dim, lit only by the glow of the fire, which cast flickering shadows on the walls and lent a theatrical quality to the proceedings. First to enter was Mrs. Veal, the kuka, large, florid woman with sleeves rolled high and arms like hams. Her brow glistened with perspiration, and she carried the defensive posture of one pulled away from her stove. "Forgive the intrusion," Holmes said, "but I require only a few moments of your time." "I didn't hear anything," she said at once, arms folded. "The kitchen's down 2 floors. You could fire a cannon in the study, and I'd not hear it over the pots." Holmes smiled faintly. "I'm more interested in routine. Did Mr. Willoughby dine alone on the evening of his death?" "Always did," she said. "Took supper in the study or not at all. Ate like a bird. Lately, he'd been skipping meals." Edith said he'd grown agitated. "Agitated?" Holmes asked. Mrs. Veal nodded. "Snapping at folk. Pacing about. Muttering over some letter. Called everyone out of the study. Once said no one should touch the cabinet behind his desk." "The cabinet?" I asked. She sniffed. "Big glass one. Held those creepy little statues. Said one of 'em was cursed." Holmes leaned forward slightly. He used the word cursed. I don't know if he meant it seriously or not, but it rattled Edith. She says he locked it the next morning. "Thank you," Holmes said. "You may go." She gave a slight curtsy and lumbered out. Next came Mr. Benson, a wiry, bearded man with calloused hands and a perpetually weathered expression. He stood straight as a soldier, arms at his sides. "You tend the estate's perimeter?" Holmes asked. "Fences, trees, hedge lines, front gate. Did you see anything unusual on the day of the murder?" Benson scratched at his beard. "Only that carriage from the city. That foreign man, odd sort, fidgeted, kept looking behind him. Spoke like he'd just run a mile, though his boots were clean." Holmes nodded. "Did he leave alone?" "I walked him to the gate. Saw him off myself." "What time was that?" "Near 5 o'clock. Was Mr. Willoughby in good spirits after?" Benson looked uncertain. Didn't see him. I'm rarely called indoors. Thank you. That will be all. After him came Henry, the stable boy, a boy of perhaps 15, all elbows and nervous energy. He blinked rapidly under Holmes's gaze. Did you see the visitor? Holmes asked. Henry nodded. Aye, sir. Tall and pale, dropped his glove as he got out of the carriage. You returned it to him? Yes. He didn't thank me. Just snatched it and ran up the steps like the house was on fire. Did Mr. Willoughby appear to know him? I couldn't say, sir, but I heard shouting. Not loud but sharp. Through the study door, maybe 20 minutes after the man went in. Holmes's brows lifted slightly. Shouting. That's new, Henry fidgeted. Didn't think I ought to tell no one. You did right, Holmes said. Who else may have heard that shouting? Only Edith. She brought in the tea after. Holmes dismissed him gently. When the door closed, we were alone again. Well, Watson, he said, there it is, an emotionally charged visit, a reference to curses, and a locked display cabinet. The cabinet, I echoed. Could that be where the third artifact was kept? I believe so. And perhaps it still is or was, until someone removed it. Recall that fragment in the hearth. It was made to vanish. Holmes stood and moved toward the door. Come, let's inspect this cabinet before anyone else decides to cleanse it by fire. Chapter 5. First suspects. The red herring, the following morning, broke bleak and gray. With heavy clouds pressed low against the sky and the trees around Marbury House whispering anxiously in the wind. Holmes, having slept not a wink, was already bent over the fire when I rose, holding the burned metal fragment we had recovered from the hearth with a pair of tweezers, turning it thoughtfully under the light. It was possibly a medallion. The edges are too smooth for a blade or tool. No maker's mark. But see the groove there. It likely held a gem or seal, something personal, possibly sacred. I poured myself a cup of the overbrewed tea left on the sideboard and approached. You believe this object to be at the heart of the murder? Holmes looked up sharply. I believe Mr. Willoughby died because of something he refused to surrender. That something was here in this house, likely locked in the cabinet, and is now either missing or destroyed. There came a sharp knock at the door, and a moment later, Inspector Gregson entered without waiting for invitation. He held a folded paper in one hand and wore the self-satisfied look of a man who believed he'd made progress. Morning, Holmes. Doctor, thought you'd like to see this. He handed the paper to Holmes. From Scotland Yard, that visitor, the one your maid spoke of. We traced his carriage. He gave the name Claude Vautrin, French citizen, former associate of the deceased. Holmes unfolded the page and scanned it. Vautrin. That explains the accent. And what do we know of him? Not much. Spent time in Egypt and Mesopotamia with Willoughby 20 years ago. But things turned bitter. Legal disputes over ownership of some unearthed items. Vautrin accused Willoughby of theft. Case was never resolved. Holmes nodded slowly. And now he returns, emotional, desperate, possibly dangerous. Gregson tapped the back of the paper. He's staying at the Little Haven Inn, 2 miles from here. I've sent a man to bring him in for questioning. And you believe this man Vautrin is our culprit? Holmes asked, his tone unreadable. Gregson's chest puffed. I do. The motive is there. the quarrel. And a French dagger lodged in the ceiling fan. Convenient coincidence, don't you think? Holmes tapped a finger against his lip. Yes, convenient indeed. Gregson missed the irony and nodded. If I had my way, I'd have him in chains by sundown. After Gregson had taken his leave, Holmes turned to me with a wry smile. Watson, you see the trap, don't you? I frowned. He does seem an obvious suspect. Too obvious. Precisely. The disgruntled foreigner, emotionally, visibly shaken, a past dispute. These details come to us wrapped too neatly. You suspect a red herring. I suspect a performance. Either someone is trying to point us toward Vautrinor, he is being manipulated without his knowledge. We waited in the drawing room until noon, when the constable returned, ushering in Claude Vautrin under Gregson's vigilant eye. He was a thin, pinched man, dressed in black with a heavy wool scarf and gloves. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, were bloodshot and rimmed with fatigue. I had nothing to do with Gareth's death. Whatever you think you know, it is not the truth. Gregson made a scoffing noise, but Holmes raised a hand. Monsieur Vautrin, please, sit. You knew Mr. Willoughby intimately. Once, Vautrin said bitterly, in youth. We studied ancient Sumerian relics together. But Gareth became obsessed. He stole from the expedition items meant for museum cataloging, sold them, kept the rarest pieces. You confronted him. I did twice over the years. He dismissed me, said they were his by right of discovery. And recently, Holmes asked. Vautrin's lips thinned. He wrote me 3 weeks ago, said he'd found something new, something dangerous, wanted to make amends, asked me to come. But when I arrived, he'd changed his mind, said the item was too powerful to trust to anyone. He was frightened. I'd never seen him that way before. What was the item? I asked. A medallion, Sumerian origin. He claimed it bore a seal of Namtarutha, god of plagues and disease. I glanced at Holmes. Namtaru. Holmes gave the faintest nod. An obscure Mesopotamian deity. Most scholars view the associated lore as myth, but Willoughby was of a different mind. Yes, he claimed it brought misfortune. Since it arrived, 3 artifacts in his care had shattered without cause. A servant's child fell ill. The dog died mysteriously. He said it whispered to him. Gregson snorted, but Holmes's expression remained cool and focused. And you? Holmes asked. Did you believe him? Vautrin hesitated. I believed he believed it. I offered to take it from him, keep it safe. He refused. He grew agitated, accused me of trying to trick him. We argued. I left. At what time? Just before 5. I walked out into the storm and returned to the inn. Can anyone verify your presence there later that night? The innkeeper. I was in the tavern from 6:30 until nearly midnight, miserable and soaked. Holmes folded his hands. You never returned here. No, Vautrin said firmly. I would never harm Gareth. Despite everything, he was my friend. Gregson remained unconvinced, but Holmes merely leaned back, his eyes distant in thought. After Vautrin had been led away, I turned to Holmes. You believe him? I believe he's telling the truth as he knows it. If he killed Willoughby, it was not out of greed, and I doubt he's capable of such a coldly theatrical murder. So if not him, then who? Holmes turned to the window. That is what we must discover. But let us not be blinded by the most convenient target. Every illusion depends on the viewer accepting the trick without looking for the wires. He reached into his pocket and withdrew one of Willoughby's unfinished letters, the one referencing the artifact as too dangerous. He feared something, Watson. Enough to lock it away. Enough to warn others not to claim it. And yet, someone was willing to kill to possess it or destroy it. The real killer, I believe, is closer than we think. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. We were seated once more in the late Professor Willoughby's study, where the shadows seemed to have deepened since the morning. Outside, the storm had passed, but the wind still stirred the bare branches into skeletal rattles. Holmes stood by the fireplace, examining again the scorched fragment we had recovered the previous night, while I reviewed Willoughby's letters, searching for some link to the mysterious medallion. He wrote the same sentence, I murmured, twice, in 2 different letters. Holmes turned. Which sentence, Watson? I held up the letters. Here, the artifact bears a curse older than the sand itself. That line appears in both this draft to Vautrin and another to an unnamed recipient. Holmes approached swiftly and took the pages from my hand. The phrasing is too deliberate to be mere repetition. He was either emphasizing a point or copying something. Copying? Holmes nodded. Yes, I suspect he read this phrase somewhere, perhaps inscribed on the medallion itself. Such warnings are not uncommon among Sumerian relics, and if Willoughby believed in its supernatural power, he may have been trying to dissuade others through mimicry of ancient texts. I folded my arms, but to whom was the second letter intended? This one here has no name. Exactly, said Holmes. An unsent letter. Or perhaps one he never intended to send. At that moment, a soft knock broke our concentration. Mrs. Hudson appeared, accompanied by Miss Margaret Hensley. The housekeeper. Begging your pardon, Margaret said, her voice tense. But I thought you should see this. She extended a narrow velvet pouch, stained with soot and stiff from heat. Holmes opened it gently. Inside was a half-melted wax seal, fused to a scorched corner of a folded parchment. A broken chain was threaded through the pouch's cord. Where did you find this? Holmes asked. In the back of the wardrobe in Professor Willoughby's room, tucked behind his winter coats. I was dusting Andwell. I remembered your interest in burnt things. Holmes's eyes glittered. Indeed. And this is most valuable. I leaned in. The seal bore a deep impression of a serpent coiled around a 7-pointed starret's scales, minutely rendered, as if etched by a craftsman obsessed with detail. That symbol, I said, I've seen it before. In one of the professor's books. Holmes's gaze narrowed. And so have I. He darted to the bookcase and began pulling volumes off the shelf, scanning their spines. After several fruitless minutes, he stopped, curious. He murmured, "The book is missing." "What book?" I asked. "Sumerian Symbology, Cults of the Forgotten Kings." Willoughby referenced it in a lecture I once attended. It was rare, privately printed. He owned one of only 3 known copies. Are you suggesting someone removed it? Not just removed it, Watson. Stole it. Along with the medallion, I would wager. Or perhaps that book was the true key. Gregson returned not long after with a report on Claude Vautrin's alibi confirmed, regrettably, by both the innkeeper and 3 patrons who had spent the evening playing cards with the man. So we're back to square one. Gregson grumbled. Unless you're going to start suspecting ghosts. Holmes remained unperturbed. Not ghosts, Inspector Ghost's stories. He held up the seal. This symbol is not merely decorative. It ties to a sect known as the Cult of Namtaru, long extinct. According to lore, their relics were bound by curse seals, believed to trap the god's wrath. Willoughby must have found one of these. Gregson shrugged. Still doesn't tell us who murdered him. No, said Holmes, but it tells us what they were looking for, and who might have known where to find it. We were interrupted, again this time, by the arrival of Beatrice Langford, Willoughby's young secretary. She entered cautiously, hands folded, eyes wary. I heard you were searching his rooms, she said. There's something I must show you. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a slim notebook, worn and dog-eared. Professor Willoughby gave this to me the day before he died. Told me not to open it unless something happened to him. Holmes took the book delicately, flipping it open. Pages of tiny, meticulous handwriting filled the journal. Dates, names, and references in Greek and Sumerian. On the third page was a list. Vautrin last contacted, 7 July H. Undecipherable, still undecided. H. Says she knows nothing L. Too curious, possibly dangerous. Someone is watching the house at night. I've seen the same figure twice. Holmes looked up slowly. L. Beatrice paled. Lucian Blackstone. He was one of Professor Willoughby's recent guests. Stayed here last week. Gregson's brows furrowed. And why didn't you mention him before? Beatrice hesitated. Because I was afraid. After he left, Professor Willoughby told me Lucian had taken something from the display room. He was furious, yet wouldn't call the police. Said it would bring more trouble. Holmes was already scribbling on a sheet of paper. We need to find Mr. Blackstone immediately. Miss Langford, do you recall where he was staying? He mentioned a residence near Richmond. I think he called it the Turret House. Holmes stood, fire kindling in his eyes. Then that's where we must go. Gregson groaned. You're dragging me all over the countryside. Holmes, better that than chasing shadows. Holmes replied crisply. For the real killer, I believe, is no longer watching the house. He thinks he has escaped scrutiny. He paused at the door, turning back to me. Watson, bring your revolver. I fear we may need it. Chapter 7. The Turret House. Shadows of the past. It was shortly past 4 o'clock when we arrived in Richmond. The cab drew to a halt before a tall, brooding structure perched at the edge of a bluff, the so-called Turret House. Its gray bricks darkened with age and ivy creeping up its flanks like grasping fingers. A single turret, narrow and slate-roofed, rose on the left side like a sentry watching the Thames bend far below. I find it oddly poetic, Holmes murmured as we stepped out, that a man obsessed with ancient curses should dwell in a place as melancholy as this. Inspector Gregson grunted. Poetic or not, if this Blackstone fellow's involved in murder, I'm putting him in cuffs. We made our way up the leaf-strewn path, boots crunching over gravel and frost. Holmes stopped at the door and rapped thrice with the end of his cane. A long pause followed. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. A man stood before us, tall, gaunt, and pale, with hair so blonde it was almost white. His face was finely sculpted, with hollow cheeks and eyes that shimmered with some unreadable intensity. He wore a dark green velvet robe, and a faint scent of incense wafted from within the house. "Mr. Lucian Blackstone?" Holmes asked. "I am," the man replied, voice low and smooth. "And you are?" "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson and Inspector Gregson. We have a few questions, sir, regarding the death of Professor Edwin Willoughby." A flicker passed across Blackstone's face, too quick for alarm, too sharp for grief. "Then you had best come in." He led us through a cold, dimly lit corridor and into a drawing room filled with peculiar objects, Sumerian tablets, faded Babylonian prints, and on the far wall, a large framed parchment bearing a seven-pointed star entwined with a serpent, the same symbol from the scorched seal. Holmes's eyes took in the room with calculated ease. "You've quite the collection, Mr. Blackstone." "I study esoteric histories," he said, "as did the late Professor Willoughby. You knew him well. We met through a symposium on Mesopotamian cults. He was brilliant, though increasingly paranoid in his final months." "And did you recently visit his residence in Bloomsbury?" Holmes asked. Blackstone did not blink. "I did. He invited me to examine a relic he believed to be connected to the cult of Nantaru, the medallion," I said. Blackstone nodded. "Yes, a fascinating object. The symbols upon it were unlike anything I'd seen etched in what we believe to be an extinct dialect of Akkadian. Willoughby believed it was one of the keys of descent, objects meant to bridge the living and the dead." "Did you take it?" Gregson asked bluntly. Blackstone's expression darkened. "No, Willoughby would not part with it. He grew irrational, accused me of coveting it. I left that night and never returned." Holmes leaned in. "And yet we have reason to believe that something was taken from his home, perhaps not by force, but through subterfuge." "I assure you," Blackstone said coldly, "if I had the medallion, I wouldn't be sitting in this house. I'd be in Baghdad, tracing its origin through the ruins of Nineveh." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "That sounds rather definitive for a man claiming ignorance." There was silence. Then Blackstone chuckled softly. "You're clever, Mr. Holmes, but this is no ordinary case. Do you know what Willoughby uncovered in that medallion?" Holmes waited. "A map," Blackstone said. "Or rather, instructions encoded within the engraving, references to coordinates and rites long forgotten. It wasn't just a relic. It was a key. A key to what?" "That," Blackstone said, "is the question he died trying to answer." Gregson stepped forward. "You'll forgive me, Mr. Blackstone, but we're going to need to search this house." Blackstone gave a slow nod. "Of course, but you won't find the medallion here. If it's missing, someone else took it." Holmes looked toward a glass cabinet on the far side of the room. "And that book, Sumerian symbology, how long have you had it?" Blackstone followed his gaze. "Professor Willoughby lent it to me months ago." "Odd. He told others he still had it." "Perhaps he forgot," Blackstone said with a slight smile. "Or perhaps he did not wish others to know who had it." Holmes stepped closer, examining the book's worn spine. "Might I take a look?" Blackstone opened the cabinet with a key and handed the volume over. Holmes flipped through its pages with deft fingers, stopping suddenly. "Watson, here." I peered over his shoulder. On the inside back cover was scrawled a series of numbers and symbols: 42.6167N, 44.6019E, coordinates, I whispered. Holmes nodded. near the Georgian-Armenian border, ancient Eurasian territory. Blackstone looked stunned. I never saw that. It must be Willoughby's handwriting. Gregson stepped back. So the professor finds an artifact with a hidden message. Someone tries to take it from him, and not long after, he's found dead with half his collection burned. And the culprit, Holmes added, knew precisely what to look for. Blackstone turned away, pouring himself a brandy with shaking fingers. You think me guilty? I think, Holmes said carefully, that someone far more dangerous may be involved. But whether you are innocent, Mr. Blackstone, depends on one thing. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze like ice. Do you know what happened the night of the fire? And are you telling us everything? Blackstone hesitated then. No, I'm not. We froze. There was someone else, he said. A woman. She came after me. I saw her through the study window that night before I left. I thought she was just one of the staff. But now I wonder, ... Holmes leaned forward. Describe her. Late 30s. Dark eyes, hair tied back. She was wearing a gardener's coat. Holmes's lips thinned. Not staff. The real thief may have hidden in plain sight. He turned abruptly. Gregson, we must return to Bloomsbury immediately. Why? Because the killer may not be a scholar or a cultist, Holmes said, eyes flashing. She may be a servant who knew too much. Chapter 8. Beneath the ashes, the woman in the shadows. By the time we returned to Bloomsbury, the evening mist had begun to slither through the cobbled streets like a restless specter. The charred remnants of Professor Willoughby's home stood in bleak silence, a hollow shell in which knowledge had once flourished. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, and the scent of smoke still clung faintly to the air. As though unwilling to let go of the memory, Holmes stepped over the boundary and into the blackened vestibule with the ease of a man retracing his own steps. I followed, with Inspector Gregson not far behind, his boots crunching on loose plaster and ash. The parlor remained gutted soot-lined beams overhead, scorched wallpaper peeling from the walls like blistered skin. She was here, Holmes murmured, eyes narrowed. The woman Blackstone described. She didn't enter by force. She was already inside, perhaps in service. Housekeeper, gardener, or, he paused, a nurse, I suggested. Holmes turned to me. Precisely. Willoughby's health had declined, according to his correspondence. He had spells of dizziness and insomnia. It would make sense to have employed a nurse discreetly, someone who could watch him closely, perhaps too closely. Gregson nodded. We didn't find any hiring records. But the housekeeper who left 2 months ago said he'd recently taken on new help, didn't say who. Holmes stepped carefully over a collapsed beam and moved into the rear study. Unlike the parlor, this room had been less ravaged. Fire had kissed the edges, but spared the heart. Shelves still lined the walls, their contents blackened but intact. A half-melted globe leaned drunkenly in the corner, and the floor bore a strange trail of fine white dust. He crouched beside the hearth and retrieved a small ceramic bowl, its rim blackened. He sniffed, then nodded. Resin, frankincense, the same scent I noted in Blackstone's home. A ritual, I asked. Perhaps, or a mimicry of one. Our thief may be clever enough to adopt the trappings of the cult to veil their true intent, disguise the theft as mysticism, set fire to erase evidence. Gregson straightened. You think the medallion was taken by this woman before the fire? Holmes nodded. Yes, and I suspect she took something else as well, a page, perhaps, or a fragment of Willoughby's notes. Holmes moved to the desk, its surface warped and singed. With gloved fingers, he lifted a cracked inkwell and revealed a faint outline in the ash beneath a rectangle. There was a notebook here, he said. A small one, I observed. Could it have contained his translations? Likely. We must identify this woman, this nurse or assistant. We know she is dark-haired, possibly late 30s, and wears gardening attire. That alone is not sufficient. Gregson rubbed his chin. There's a ledger at the local chemist's on Woburn Walk. He was known to get prescriptions filled there. If this woman were collecting on his behalf, her name might be on the register. Holmes's eyes lit up. Excellent, Gregson. Let's visit the chemist while the trail still holds warmth. The shopkeeper at the Woburn Walk pharmacy was a stooped, elderly man with thick spectacles and a cheerful disposition despite the hour. He peered at the register with a squint, flipping pages with care. Yes, here we are, he muttered. Professor Willoughby. A recurring order of laudanum tincture and valerian extract, collected fortnightly. Collected by whom? Holmes asked. The man tapped the margin of the entry with a gnarled finger. Signed for by a Miss E. Rosamond. She came regularly from early April to mid. Always polite, dark-haired woman with sharp features. Wore a dark green hat with a feather peculiar fashion for a nurse. Do you have an address? Gregson asked. The man turned the book slightly. Clockenwell, St. Jude's Lane, number 23. Holmes's eyes gleamed. That is no boarding house. That address belongs to an apothecary's loft. She may be hiding in plain sight. We arrived at St. Jude's Lane well past sunset. The lane was narrow, ill-lit, and lined with crooked buildings that seemed to lean toward one another like whispering conspirators. Number 23 stood at the far end, a shuttered storefront with an unmarked door above. Gregson pounded on it with firm authority. A shuffle sounded within, then a cautious voice. Who is it? Scotland Yard, Gregson replied. Badge at the ready. Open up. The bolt slid slowly. The door creaked inward. The woman who appeared had the same hawkish features. The chemist described sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, dark hair swept into a bun. She wore a threadbare robe over nurse's garments and looked at us with wary defiance. Holmes asked. She said nothing. I am Sherlock Holmes. We are investigating the death of Professor Willoughby. You were in his employ. Her hands twitched, tightening on the robe. I was hired to help him sleep, she said softly. He was ill, frightened, said there were dreams whispers in the walls, and yet you never reported his worsening condition to authorities. Nor did you mention being present the night he died. She hesitated. Because I wasn't. Then how, Holmes said gently, did your scarf end up in the ash heap beneath his study window? Her breath caught. For a moment, the bravado wavered. Holmes stepped forward. You saw something that night, perhaps more than you should have, and you took something, not just the medallion. She turned away, moving to a desk. From a drawer, she drew out a small leather-bound notebook. Willoughby's hand scrawled across the cover. I didn't kill him, she whispered, but I knew someone would. Who? Gregson demanded. She looked at us, eyes wide with fear, because someone else was in that house. Not Blackstone, not me, a third presence. I heard her voice through the study door. Her I echoed. Miss Rosamond nodded. She spoke a dialect I didn't recognize, and Willoughby answered in the same tongue. Moments later, I saw light beneath the door, and then the fire began. Holmes took the notebook. "You've been hiding ever since." I was afraid. Whatever she was, she wasn't human. Chapter 9. Echoes in an ancient tongue. Miss Rosamond's confession lingered in the stale air of the loft, like incense in a cryptic, cloying and tainted with dread. Holmes turned the notebook over in his hands with careful reverence, as though the weight of the charred dead hung from its spine. The name etched on the front, Professor E. Willoughby, was nearly obscured by ash and soot smudges, but unmistakably his. She was speaking in a language I've never heard. Rosamond whispered again, clutching her robe tightly around her. It wasn't Latin, not Greek either. Older, sharper, like flint scraping on bone. Holmes gave a slight nod. "You said," Willoughby responded in the same tongue. "Yes." She glanced toward the darkened window, voice trembling. He stammered at first, but then he knew it. It poured out of him like it had been waiting, buried in his blood. "I heard a sound, like wind beneath the earth. It rattled the glass and made the walls feel thinner. I ran." Gregson's hand hovered near his coat pocket. "And the woman? I never saw her. Only her shadow, long and crooked, on the wall. It moved when she didn't." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, though my mind recoiled from the unnatural imagery. I could not dismiss the sincerity etched in Rosamond's face. Holmes opened the notebook with careful fingers. The first few pages were filled with densely packed Latin marginalia, scribbled in the professor's tight hand. But deeper within, the writing changed. Characters twisted like vines, sentences looped into themselves, forming sigils more than syntax. "Do you recognize this script?" I asked Holmes quietly. He tapped a finger on the page. "Proto-Phatic, possibly older. A hybrid script, the same tongue used in the medallion's inscription." "You mean the daughters of Yid?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "If Willoughby spoke this tongue fluently in his final moments, it implies to possibilities he had already unlocked far more than he let on. Or he was being used as a vessel." Gregson frowned. "Vessel?" Holmes snapped the notebook shut. "I believe the cult does not merely revere ancient languages or rituals. It channels them into the minds of the susceptible. Willoughby was not just translating the mythos, he was living it." I swallowed. "And the woman who visited him, was she one of these daughters?" Holmes turned to Rosamond. "You said her voice wasn't human. Could it have been mechanical, masked?" She shook her head. "No, it was too clear, like it was inside my skull." Gregson shifted uneasily. "I've heard, if there's a cult operating with access to hypnotic rituals or poisons, we need to bring them in." Holmes raised a hand. "And where would you start, Inspector? We know neither their number nor their name. Only that 2 men are dead, a medallion is missing, and a woman no one saw has disappeared into the fog." Gregson grunted. "So what now?" Holmes pocketed the notebook. "Now we trace the language." The following morning, we stood before the blackened facade of the British Museum's lesser-known manuscripts wing, long before the crowds arrived. A contact of Holmes's awaited us within Professor Nathaniel Gorham, a specialist in pre-Sumerian script and esoteric linguistics. Gorham was a gaunt man with stooped shoulders and eyes so pale they seemed almost translucent. He wore a threadbare suit that smelled faintly of cedarwood and pipe tobacco. Holmes wasted no time. He laid the notebook before him on the professor's desk. "I need your assessment on this passage," Holmes said. "Specifically, this sequence here." Gorham adjusted his lenses and bent forward. As his eyes scanned the looping symbols, a strange hush descended over the study. "This," he murmured, "is not a language in the conventional sense. It's phonetic, yes, but the structure is recursive. Each phrase folds inward. Meaning is derived not just from the words, but from the pattern they form across the page. You've seen it before?" Holmes asked. Gorham nodded slowly. "Once, years ago, in a clay fragment unearthed. The locals called it the tongue of the drowned moon. Myth claimed it belonged to a race of women who came from the sea and taught kings to dream of fire. Madness followed their voices. Where is that fragment now?" I asked. Gorham glanced toward the museum vault. "Locked away. Even copies are forbidden. The last curator who translated it took his own life." There was silence. Holmes finally said, "Could a modern Speaker Willoughby, for instance, reproduce it without influence?" "Unlikely," said Gorham. "It's too complex." "Unless he stopped." "Unless," Holmes prompted. "Unless someone was teaching him, or guiding him. A lineage, a priestess, a daughter," I whispered. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we must find the next link in the chain." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the notebook beside several documents he had retrieved from his archives. "Willoughby, Blackstone, and our unknown woman are connected not merely by academia," he muttered. "They are connected, a shared belief or an inherited curse." I stared at the symbols again. "What does it mean, Holmes? What is this all for?" He exhaled. "I believe we are dealing with a cult not interested in worship, but awakening. The medallion, the language, the firet is all ritual, preparation, and the final piece has yet to fall." Just then, a soft knock echoed through the flat. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter. "No postmark," she said. "Delivered by hand. No return address." Holmes slit the seal. Inside was a single sheet. On it, a phrase written in the same recursive tongue and a location, "Under the 9th bell, tonight." We looked at one another in silence. Holmes rose, eyes storm gray. "They are calling us, Watson." The circle tightens. Chapter 10. Under the 9th beltha, evening fog, thick and gray, swallowing the flickering gas lamps and muffling the wheels of passing hansom. Holmes and I walked side by side beneath its ghostly veil, following the Maples' instruction of the cryptic note, "Under the 9th bell, tonight." "It's not a riddle," Holmes said, as we turned onto Elmbrook Lane. "It's a reference. A place known only to a select few. And you think you've found it. I know it. There's a derelict chapel just off Penberry Cross St. Auriel's, abandoned since 1862, when the vestry collapsed. Its belfry once held 9 bells. Only 8 remain. The 9th was said to toll for the dead in dreams." "Charming," I muttered. "And you believe they've chosen this site for their next ritual?" "I believe it is where the next veil will be lifted," Holmes replied, eyes glinting with cold anticipation. We approached the ruins just before the clock struck midnight. The chapel stood like a skeleton in the Foggett's spire, cracked, stained glass windows shattered, and vines snaking through its crumbling stones. A wrought iron fence, long corroded, stood ajar As we crossed the threshold into the nave, the air grew still, heavy with mildew and charred incense. Moonlight streamed through the broken roof, painting the cracked floor in a lattice of pale beams. "There," Holmes said, pointing toward the chancel. A stairwell once sealed with timber now gaped open. A recent disturbance. We descended with care, each step creaking like a whispered warning. The stone beneath our feet grew damp and uneven, and soon we emerged into a vaulted crypt lined with alcoves, their niches long since robbed of coffins. Holmes raised a lantern. "Look, Simples." They were carved into the keystone arch above the entryway, the same recursive language, now chiseled in neat rows. At their center, a sigil resembling a crescent womb, encircled by weeping eyes. "What do they mean?" I asked. Holmes studied them. A phrase repeated 3 times, loosely translated, "She who waits beneath." A sound echoed behind us, a slow, rhythmic chant, low and feminine. We turned sharply, lantern swinging, down another passage. A faint light pulsed, warm and golden. Holmes gestured silently, and we crept forward, keeping to the shadows. The passage opened into a subterranean chamber, octagonal in shape, its walls lined with rusted sconces. At its center, beneath a stone arch hung with tattered velvet, stood a group of figures, cloaked in crimson. They formed a circle around a woman kneeling on the floor. She was young, no more than 30, with raven hair and a vacant stare. A medallion identical to the one Willoughby had possessed was pressed to her chest by the cloaked woman behind her. Taller, older, face obscured by a silver veil. The chant rose, words not meant for the living. Holmes placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "They're attempting a transfer. A vessel. Watch closely." Before I could respond, the woman in the veil raised her hands, and the chamber pulsed with an unnatural warmth. Shadows danced in unnatural directions. My skin prickled as if a static current had risen from the earth. Then the kneeling woman spoke, not in English, not in any human tongue, but in the same flint-like language Rosamond had described. Only now it was deeper, older, as though her throat echoed with voices not her own. I stumbled back, nauseated. Holmes held firm, eyes locked on the ritual. The chanting stopped. The veiled woman leaned forward and whispered something directly into the initiate's ear. The girl's eyes widened, then rolled back. She collapsed. The others moved swiftly. One anointed her brow with black ink. Another draped her in a robe of ochre silk. Holmes leaned close to me. "They've completed the rite. She is no longer who she was," I whispered. "We must stop them." Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. If we act now, we learn nothing. But if we let her leave..." Suddenly, one of the cloaked women turned. Her eyes met Holmes's across the chamber. Then she smiled with a sharp gesture. The ritual leader barked something in the ancient tongue. The lights went out, total. Blackness swallowed us. "Watsamu." I grabbed his arm as footsteps thundered in all directions. We ran back through the tunnel, shadows racing alongside us. Behind, a hiss-like wind screaming through a tomb followed close. We reached the stairwell just as the first torch was hurled. It exploded against the stone, flames licking the arch. Up we fled, bursting into the night, smoke curling from the chapel below. Holmes didn't pause. He ran until we reached the street, the fog partying around us like a curtain of ghosts. Only then did he stop, chest heaving. "They saw us," I gasped. "They knew we were watching." "Yes," Holmes replied grimly, "which means they'll change tactics. We've lost our only chance to stop them." He shook his head. "No, Watson. We've seen their process. We know the medallion is the key, and now we know there is a leader. A high priestess, possibly the first daughter, and the girl. She's the new vessel," he said. "But they're not finished. They've only begun." I looked back toward the chapel, where firelight still glimmered through shattered glass. "Then where do we go now?" Holmes held up the notebook once more, his fingers brushing the ancient script. "We return to the beginning," he said, "to the place where Willoughby first uncovered the medallion, to where it all began." Chapter 11. The Whispering Stones. We departed London before dawn, the first streaks of pale light stretching across the eastern horizon as our train carved its way through the countryside. Holmes, hunched in thought beside me, had spoken little since our escape from the chapel. His fingertips tapped idly on the medallion, now wrapped in a silk handkerchief and tucked inside his coat. "That's where it began," I nodded. "The excavation Willoughby attended in 1893, the one cut short after the collapse." Holmes's lip curled. "A convenient explanation for a dozen missing men and a sealed report? But I believe the site was closed, not for safety, but secrecy. Do you suppose the object was discovered there?" "No," he said, eyes narrowing. "I believe it was uncovered. Dug out, perhaps, but not by accident. Something wanted." It frowned. The train slowed as we reached the outskirts of Bake. From there, it was a short journey by hired trap to the moors beyond. Rolling fields gave way to bleak outcroppings of stone and heather. And then, on the ridge above a ravine, we saw them 3 jagged stones arranged in a crescent, their surfaces slick with moss and age. "The Whispering Stones," Holmes murmured. "Local legend claims they speak during the solstice. I suspect they mark the entrance to what?" "To her," Holmes said softly. "Or what remains of her." We dismounted and approached the stones. Up close, I could see the markings lines carved deep into the granite. Holmes bent down, brushing away soil at the base of the center stone. His fingers found a metal loop. With a sharp pull, a hidden trapdoor groaned open, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. "I suppose you'll insist we go first," I muttered. Holmes offered a tight smile. "Quite." The ladder was rusted, but held our weight. At the bottom, we entered a low tunnel, its walls lined with ancient stone. The air was damp and earthy, laced with a strange metallic temps. We moved slowly, lantern light flickering off slick walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance. Then we heard it, a whisper, no more than a breeze at first, like air escaping through cracks. But then it formed syllables, half-words, names we did not know. Holmes stopped. "It's the same voice," he said, "the one from the chapel." The tunnel opened into a cavern. Its floor was covered in bone-dry silt, and in the center stood a stone pedestal, its top marked with the weeping eye sigil. Around it were broken urns, remnants of scrolls, and old tools. Holmes circled the pedestal, examining the markings. "These are far older than any known British text," he said. "Pre-Roman, perhaps even pre-Celtic." I knelt near a shattered urn and found the edge of parchment preserved by dryness. Its ink had faded, but the glyphs remained the same spiral-laced symbols. This chamber, I said, could be thousands of years old. Holmes nodded. I suspect this is the original sanctuary, a womb carved for the goddess they worship. She who waits beneath key pressed the medallion into a circular depression at the pedestal's center. A low hum filled the chamber. The walls trembled. Something behind the pedestal clicked. A panel slid open in the stone, revealing a small reliquary chamber beyond. Within, laid on a bed of obsidian shards, was a skull. Small, elongated, non-human. Holmes's breath caught. This is what they protect. I stepped forward, unsettled. What is it? I don't know, Holmes whispered. But the structure of this skull's not natural. This isn't a burial, it's a preservation. He reached for a blackened scroll beside it. Unrolling it carefully, a map, or rather, a star chart interlaced with runes and pathways that spiraled inward to a central point. It's not just a ritual, he said at last. It's a pattern, a prophecy. These women, they believe they're bringing something back. Suddenly, we heard voices above, muffled but closing fast. Holmes's eyes darkened. They followed us. He snatched the scroll, replaced the medallion, and closed the panel with a hard shove. Come, Watson. We've found all we need. Now we must ensure they do not retrieve it again. We climbed quickly, the echo of footsteps chasing us up the shaft. Holmes turned back for a final glance at the stones. She's waking, he muttered, and for the first time I saw it in his eyes. Not excitement, not triumph, but fear. Chapter 12. The letters of ash and bone. We did not return to London by the same route. Ever cautious when shadowed, led us westward into the low valleys of Matlock, exchanging our hired trap for a coal cart bound for Sheffield. From there, a series of untraceable transfers in near Wakefield, a freight train to Bedford, and finally a private carriage arranged by Mycroft himself saw us safely back to Baker Street. Under the cover of night, Holmes did not speak for hours. When we arrived, he dismissed Mrs. Hudson with uncharacteristic abruptness and shut the sitting room doors tight. Light the lamps, Watson. Everyone. No shadows. I obeyed without question. Holmes laid out the items from the whispering stones across his work table. The preserved scroll, a torn parchment from the urn, and a hastily sketched copy of the strange star map. The skull he had wisely left behind, swasealed once more behind the pedestal. But the scroll, blackened, brittle, was of immediate concern. What do you make of this? He asked, passing it to me with gloved hands. The symbols were precise, geometric, yet fluid circles within circles. Sharp, intersecting lines that resembled the positioning of celestial bodies. They pulsed with an eerie symmetry that stirred a vague discomfort within me. It's not a language in the traditional sense, I said. It's more a system, a ritual pattern, perhaps. Holmes nodded grimly. Or a key. He unrolled the map beside it. This is no mere superstition. These women, this order, they are calculating something. A return, a convergence. I frowned. But a return of what? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he retrieved an envelope from the fireplace mantel, charred slightly at the edges. The paper bore no stamp or address, only a symbol, the weeping eye pressed into the wax seal. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet. Scrawled across it in faded, hurried script was a warning. Do not awaken her. The others dream still. H.L. My heart lurched. H.L. Holmes. That's Henry Lawton, the expedition geologist from Derbyshire, the one presumed dead in 1893. Holmes nodded. And yet this note was delivered yesterday. Mycroft intercepted it from one of his handlers before it reached me directly. So Lawton lives. If he does, he may be the only survivor of that cursed dig, and he knows precisely what it was they unearthed. Holmes crossed to his bookshelves, removing several dusty volumes on early pagan traditions. He flipped to a marked Paja sketch of the whispering stones under a midsummer moon, accompanied by a translation from a 14th century monk. They call her the Lady Beneath, entombed in flame and ice. Her name is carved in ash and sung in dreams. When the stones weep, she shall rise. A myth, I said uneasily. Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. All truth begins as myth. Even science was once alchemy. He turned back to the scroll. And yet these women, across generations, have waited, watched, guarded. They believe they are chosen not to remember, but to resurrect. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. A storm was rising over London. Holmes pressed the medallion once more into the scroll's markings. The metal seemed to thrum faintly in response, reacting to the symbols like a tuning fork. I believe this is a cipher, Holmes said, and the scroll, a guide. But the real ritual of it exists lies still ahead. He looked to me, eyes sharp as ever, but shadowed with fatigue. We must find Lawton, Watson, before they do. I nodded. And if he's already dead, Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. Then the dead may soon speak louder than the living. Chapter 13. The Man Who Should Be Deaded. Was nearing midnight when Holmes laid his violin aside and turned to me with that particular glint in his eye. Neither joy nor triumph, but the sharp focus of a mind locking into its target. How does a man presumed dead, unaccounted for in official records for over a decade, deliver a letter by hand to a government channel in Mayfair? I would say he didn't, I replied, unless he had help. Precisely. Holmes rose and strode toward the map pinned to our north wall. A thin line of red twine now connected Derbyshire to 3 marked points in London: a solicitor's office in High Holborn, the Turkish Baths in Northumberland Avenue, and, to my surprise, a disused chapel near Bethnal Green. Mycroft has traced Lawton's letter to a drop-off arranged via this chapel. St. Kildas, officially condemned in 1898. Yet still receiving regular nocturnal visitors. And you believe Lawton is there? I believe he is in contact with someone there. A go-between, possibly another survivor. I nodded slowly, then reached for my revolver and coat. Then we'll pay them a visit. Holmes's smile was brief and bleak. Bring a lantern. And be sure it holds steady flame. The fog in Bethnal Green that night was thick as treacle and just as heavy on the lungs. We moved silently through the deserted backstreet, the iron fences of disused tenements, looming like crooked sentries. St. Kildas sat at the far end of a cobbled cul-de-sac, its windows boarded, its stonework green with time. Above the arched doorway, a half-yearsed carving still read, "Let the light guide those who sleep." Charming, I muttered. Holmes said nothing. He pushed gently at the warped door. It groaned open with a reluctant creak. Inside, the scent of mildew and old incense clung to the air. The pews had long since rotted, leaving only skeletal wooden frames and the occasional smashed pane of stained glass. At the far end, beneath what remained of the altar, we saw a flicker of candlelight. We advanced slowly, every step echoing like a dropped coin in a tomb. Then a voice, hoarse, trembling, spoke from behind the pulpit. "You're late." Holmes stepped forward. Henry Lawton. The man who emerged looked more ghost than human. His face was drawn, beard unkempt, skin stretched thin over high cheekbones. His eyes, however, retained a burning lucidity that belied the ruin of his frame. "I told them not to come," he rasped. "Told them the tomb was sealed for a reason." Holmes offered him a seat, and Lawton sank into it as though the air itself were too heavy to bear. "You survived the collapse at Wetley Crag," Holmes said. "But why vanish?" "I didn't vanish," Lawton said bitterly. "I hid when the chanting began. When Wilson dug too deep. When we found her, I shivered despite the warmth of the lantern." "What did you find, Mr. Lawton?" Holmes asked gently. He looked up at us, then haunted, wild. "She's not a woman. She was never human. She was worshipped before there was speech, buried beneath the stone to keep the earth safe. And those women, they're not, they're guards, dream-bound and blood-oathed." Holmes leaned forward. "And now, they're waking her," Lawton whispered. "Piece by piece. The relics are keys. The scroll, the skull, the medallions, not just ritual, it's remembrance. When the pattern is complete, she won't be a dream anymore." There was a long silence. Then Holmes asked, "Can she be stopped?" Lawton looked at us both, weary and broken. "She can't be stopped, but she can be delayed." A sound, a dry rustle like silk on stone cut through the chapel. Holmes stood at once. "We're not alone." Lawton's face twisted in panic. "They followed you." She sees through them. From the back pews, shadows began to move. I raised my pistol as a figure in gray stepped forward, face veiled, hand outstretched. Holmes pulled a vial from his coat. A sudden flash, and the air filled with choking smoke. "Out, Watson," he barked. "Get Lawton out." We burst into the night, with Lawton between us, coughing and stumbling. The chapel behind us groaned as though breathing, then fell silent once more. Only Holmes dared look back. "She knows we're coming," he said softly. Then we vanished into the fog. Chapter 14. Blood in the Pattern. By dawn, we had returned Lawton to Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson, horrified by his appearance, nonetheless rose to the task with tea, broth, and quiet comfort. He sat swaddled in blankets, his voice low and uncertain, but clearer with each sip. Holmes, meanwhile, prowled the flat with sharp energy, pausing only to examine the ancient medallion once more beneath his glass. The symbols etched into its surface now seemed to pulse with greater clarity, as though Lawton's tale had awakened something not only in memory, but in meaning. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "recall the scroll discovered at Wetley Crag. A ritual bound in ancient ink. Yes, but more than that. A sequence, a summoning, incomplete. And the medallion forms part of that sequence," I murmured, catching on. "A key," he said. "You believe the cult intends to gather all the artifacts?" "They already have two," Holmes replied grimly. "The scroll and the skull. Lawton brought us the medallion that makes 3. Lawton stirred on the settee. They'll need the last one, he croaked. The final piece. The relic buried with Hertha I. Holmes turned. You know its location? Lawton hesitated. We found records, fragments. It's said to lie beneath the oldest part of the Temsa temple sealed in Roman times. But I never learned more. Wilson did. Before the dream took him, Holmes narrowed his eyes. Then we must speak with Wilson. Lawton's expression darkened. You can't. He's dead. Are you sure? Holmes asked quietly. Or merely told that he was? A silence settled between us like dust. Holmes crossed to the desk and unfurled a battered map of London's underground. If the cult seeks to retrieve the eye, it must be through access beneath the river, likely through disused sewers or sealed crypts. There are 3 possible points of ingress near Blackfriars Bridge, all abandoned, all perfect for concealment. He tapped a point with a long finger. Watson, ready your revolver. We arrived at Blackfriars in the late afternoon. The city above, oblivious to the strange currents stirring below. Holmes led the way into a disused maintenance tunnel, lantern in hand, navigating by instinct and the old surveyor's map. The air grew colder as we descended, and the stone grew slick with mildew. We passed rusted pipes, collapsed brick arches, and finally, an iron gate so corroded that Holmes wrenched it open with the flat of his boot. Beyond lay a chamber, untouched by time. The scent of ancient incense clung to the stones like perfume on a corpse. In the center stood an altar, no Christian markings, only a ring of blackened symbols, like those etched into the medallion. Surrounding it, 5 tall iron braziers stood cold. Holmes knelt, studying the floor. The chalk is fresh, he murmured. They've been here, preparing. Suddenly, a whisper echoed through the chamber, soft and overlapping, as though many voices spoke in unison. We turned, lanterns sweeping the gloom. A single figure emerged from the far shadows, clad in gray. A woman veiled. She stepped into the light and slowly lifted the veil. Holmes drew a sharp breath. It was Margaret Wilson. Her eyes, once a pale and intelligent green, were now black, utterly black, as if the pupils had devoured the iris entirely. She smiled, lips cracked with dryness. You're too late, she said softly. The eye is near. The pattern will be complete. Holmes raised a hand. Margaret, listen to me. You are not yourself. You are being used. I am awakened, she whispered, voice like wind through grave grass. She waits behind the veil. You cannot stop what has already begun. She extended her hand, palm up. In it lay a silver coin engraved with the same markings as the medallion. Not a relic, but something new. Something forged, she remembers, Margaret said. Then, with an eerie stillness, she turned and melted into the shadows. Holmes and I were left in the chill silence, the lantern casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. She's accelerating, Holmes murmured. The cult must be close to the final piece. And now we know Margaret is no longer a victim. She's a vessel. I shivered. Then what do we do? Holmes's eyes met mine. We go to the river, he said, to the place where dreams end and gods begin. Chapter 15. The temple beneath the Thames. The boat bobbed gently beneath us, tethered in the narrow mouth of an inlet just off the Thames. A dull mist pressed low over the water, thick as wool, muffling the city's voice to a distant murmur. The tide had turned, revealing the cracked stone steps Holmes had marked on the map, the entrance to a forgotten Roman structure that predated even the Christian shrines of Llandinium. We descended without a word. The ancient stone groaned beneath our weight, slick with the damp of centuries. As we passed through the threshold, a rush of stale air met us heavy, like a tomb unsealed. Holmes led, his lantern casting fitful light on carvings that lined the walls. Figures, half erased by erosion, danced along the stone, women crowned with antlers, spiral patterns, eyes etched in infinite repetitions. "Note the eye motif," Holmes muttered, "the same as the medallion. Repetition isn't symbolic, here it's ritualistic, a summoning, not just an inscription." We entered a vaulted hall where columns slanted inward like leaning sentinels. At its center, a sunken platform formed a basin, black water, still and glassy within. The air shimmered faintly, as if the humidity carried more than moisture, something invisible, yet present. Suddenly, Holmes halted. "Footprints," he said quietly, kneeling beside the basin's edge. He traced the impressions in the dust, fresh, unmistakable. 5 distinct sets, all recent. "They've come," I whispered. "No," Holmes said, rising. "They're here." From the far end of the chamber, a series of low murmurs began, soft, droning syllables in a tongue I could not place. The darkness stirred, coalescing into hooded forms as 5 robed figures stepped into view. Their faces were obscured by masks antique, like Grecian theater visages, but their posture radiated intent. One stepped forward. In his gloved hand was the missing relic, a black obsidian eye set into a frame of silver. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. Behind him, she emerged, Margaret Wilson, veiled again in ash-gray robes, now held the scroll. Its parchment fluttered slightly despite the still air, as though reacting to some deeper current. She approached the basin and began to speak in that same guttural rhythm. The eye, the scroll, the skull, and the medallion all assembled now. "They intend to awaken her here," Holmes said quietly, his voice tight. Before I could speak, Holmes stepped forward. "Margaret." The chant paused. She turned. "You were not born to be a vessel," he said. "You were a scholar, a seeker of knowledge, not its slave." Her lips parted, but it was not Margaret who answered. "She is knowledge," came the voice. It echoed through the chamber, not from her mouth, but through the stones themselves, cold, feminine, eternal. The basin shimmered. Water began to rise, not overflowing, but lifting, forming the suggestion of a shape, a woman's silhouette formed from liquid and shadow. Her face featureless, save for a single, unblinking eye where her brow should be. Holmes gritted his teeth. "We need to break the circle." "But how?" I asked, revolver in hand, useless against deities. "The pattern is bound to the eye," Holmes said. "It's the anchor." He drew the medallion from his coat. "When placed within the scroll's geometry, it will close the ritual. But reverse the position, you shatter it," I said, catching on. Holmes flung the medallion with sudden, calculated force. It struck the obsidian eye in the cultist's hand with a sharp crack. The eye split. A sound unlike any I've heard tore through the chamber, a shriek that was neither wholly sonic nor wholly earthly. The basin convulsed. The water figure collapsed. slamming back into the stone with a splash that felt like a clap of thunder. The robed figures staggered. Margaret clutched her head, a scream torn from her throat as the scroll ignited spontaneously, curling into blackened fragments. Then silence, real, blessed silence. Holmes approached Margaret cautiously. She looked up, her eyes, her own once, more green and wide with horror. "Where am I?" she asked, voice shaking. "Home," Holmes said softly. "You're safe now." As we emerged into the misty night above, the river lapping gently at our boots, I looked back at the stairwell descending into darkness. It felt as though we had merely delayed something far older than ourselves. Holmes, standing beside me, gazed out over the water. "This is not over," he said quietly. "We've severed one limb, but the body sleeps still. And somewhere beneath the Thames, I swear I heard the soft ripple of something turning in the depths." Chapter 16. The Whisper Returns. A week had passed since the shattered eye sank beneath the river's surface, and the ancient voice was silenced at least for now. Holmes and I had returned to Baker Street, but the flat bore a strange stillness, as though even the walls had absorbed some of the unease from that temple beneath the Thames. Holmes sat in his chair, violin untouched at his side. The fire crackled, untouched. His pipe lay cold on the mantel. "I must confess, Holmes," I said, breaking the silence. "I expected you to be more at ease now that the ritual is broken." Holmes did not look at me, but kept his gaze on the window, where the drizzle of late October rain streaked the glass like tears. "Ease, my dear Watson, is for those who believe resolution is absolute. We have disrupted a ritual, yes, but we have not undone the forces behind it." He turned to me then, his face gaunt, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Have you slept soundly since that night?" I faltered. "I know. I keep hearing that voice, though it never speaks a full word, only a breath, a whisper." Holmes nodded slowly. "So have I." A knock at the door interrupted our morbid reflection. Mrs. Hudson answered, but it was not her voice that called out. It was Inspector Lestrade. He stepped into the room, hat in hand, face pale. "Gentlemen, I wouldn't trouble you if it weren't urgent." Holmes gestured for him to speak. "What is it?" Lestrade cleared his throat and looked between us with clear discomfort. "There's been a death down by the Chelsea embankment." "A drowning?" Holmes asked, not even blinking. "Yes, or at least that's how it appears. But the body's dry, Holmes, dry as bone." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Lestrade continued, voice lowered. "The strange part, the woman who found him claims she heard singing a woman's voice, said it echoed from the river." Holmes rose. "We must go." "But," I began. Holmes had already fetched his coat. We arrived at the embankment just as the body was being removed. The constables stood well away from it, muttering superstitions under their breath. The victim was a man of about 50, face locked in a contorted expression of horror. His clothes were intact, but his skin was wrinkled and withered like old parchment. His hands were clasped tightly to his chest, fingers broken from the force of his grip. Holmes crouched beside him. He died in rapture or agony, perhaps both. He turned to the officer nearest. "Where exactly was he found?" The young constable pointed to a spot near the tide's edge where the water gently lapped the stone. Holmes strode toward it. I followed, noting the stillness of the water. It felt unnatural, Even the wind had died here. Holmes crouched again, inspecting the river's edge. Something gleamed just beneath the surface. With his cane, he fished it out, a fragment of silver half-melted, and unmistakably the frame of the obsidian eye. But that was destroyed, I said. Holmes stood slowly, water dripping from the artifact. Nothing truly dies that was never truly born, he murmured. This piece has surfaced as a message. I looked at him. A message? From whom? Holmes turned toward the water. The Thames stretched into darkness, the faint orange of gas lamps trembling on its surface. She's speaking again, he said softly. Not with words, but symbols, echoes she cannot manifest yet. But she can whisper. And in that moment, standing beside the river, I thought I heard it again, a sigh. Not the wind, not the current, something beneath. Chapter 17, The Return to Highgate. Morning after the discovery at the embankment. Holmes sat rigid in his chair, the broken eye fragment balanced delicately on a silk handkerchief atop his lap. He studied it for hours, his brows furrowed, lips pursed, as though willing the thing to speak. It's singing, he muttered finally. I looked up from my notes. What do you mean? He didn't answer directly, but rose abruptly. We must go back to the origin, Watson. Back to where this all began. I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. Highgate, he nodded once, briskly. There is more buried in that earth than bones. We arrived near twilight. The cemetery loomed before us in all its overgrown decay. Angels cloaked in moss, mausoleums flaked with the scars of time. As we stepped into the narrowing path toward the circle of Lebanon, Holmes grew unusually quiet, his steps cautious, as if afraid to wake the ground. Notice anything? He asked. The shadows shifted, but not with the wind. Leaves barely rustled, yet an almost imperceptible vibration hummed beneath our boots. It's as though the earth is breathing, I whispered. Holmes agreed with a solemn nod. Or listening. The stone arch leading into the circle bore a new Mark III crescent-shaped. Grooves carved into the lintel, fresh the edges gleamed, slightly in the waning light that wasn't there before. I noted. No, Holmes said grimly. And it's not merely vandalism, it's a symbol. One we saw in the temple beneath the Thames. A glyph of renewal. Someone is trying to reopen what we closed. We entered the circle. The tomb that once held the priestess now shattered lay, scattered in fragments across the ground. Holmes inspected the stones. Disturbed, he said. But not recently. The real activity is there. He pointed toward the far edge of the circle, where a crypt once sealed now lay slightly ajar. A rust-colored smear stained the handle. He approached and with a firm push opened the crypt fully. The interior was pitch black. Holmes lit a lantern and descended the first few stone steps. Wait here, Watson. If I don't return in 5 minutes, I followed him immediately. Nonsense. You know I would never allow that. He didn't argue. The steps wound down into a narrow catacomb. The air grew dense and warm, unlike the chill of the graveyard above. There was a scent metallic, sweet, and sickening at the base of the stair. The passage opened into a small chamber. Bones lined the walls. And in the center stood something that turned my stomach. A pedestal, and upon it, another obsidian eye-hole, unbroken. Holmes' single quotes as breath caught. Impossible. He stepped closer. The lantern flickered as we neared. The eye was identical in shape and design, but this one shimmered faintly, a pulse, like a heartbeat. "I shattered this," Holmes whispered. I approached cautiously. "Then what is this?" "A copy." Holmes didn't answer. He reached into his coat and produced the fragment from the river. As he held it up, the two pieces resonated, one broken, one whole. The air grew heavy. A pressure built around us. Holmes stumbled backward, clutching his head, voices whispering again. Clearer this time. She was never drowned. She was sealed. I grabbed Holmes and dragged him away from the pedestal. The whispering ceased the moment we crossed the threshold of the chamber. Holmes sagged against the wall, breathing hard. "They've made another," he rasped. He looked up, eyes wild. "Whoever survived the collapse, whoever preserved the rights. This wasn't the end, Watson. That eye in the template was only a vessel. This is a rebirth." We hurried back up the stairs. The crypt door slammed shut behind us without a touch. I drew my revolver instinctively, though I knew it would be of no use. Holmes's expression was not fear, but fury. "They've moved the ceremony here," he said. "The ritual continues." And above us, in the sky bruised with night, the moon hung in a perfect crescent, matching the glyph on the arch. Chapter 18. The Bone. Squires Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. A weight hung about us, not merely of dread, but inevitability. The black eye in the Highgate crypt was no accident. It was preparation, a second act to a performance long thought closed. The lines between ritual and reason blurred more with each passing clue. Holmes, pacing the length of the sitting room, no longer wore the air of the aloof logician. Instead, he resembled a man standing on the brink of something ancient, something personal. "The eye is not just symbolic, Watson," he said suddenly, stopping near the hearth. "It is a frequency, a tuning fork between worlds." He gestured toward his violin on the stand. "I need sound and silence." He began to play, not a melody, but a pattern arcs of dissonance, interrupted by abrupt stillness. As he drew his bow across the strings, I realized what he was imitating. "The chanting," I whispered, "from the temple beneath the Thames." Holmes nodded. "But this time, we change the rhythm. We close the circuit." The notes grew stranger still, bending against one another until the very room seemed to waver. Bookshelves rattled. The gaslights trembled. And then beneath it, Ali heard it. Bones, rattling, a choir of them, not here, but beneath. Holmes dropped the violin. "Under London. Always under. Where the city forgets." He raced to the map on the wall, pulling it down to reveal a second older. "Faded. Here," he said, jabbing a point near the Old Bailey. "The Roman ossuaries. A site untouched in 100 years." Within the hour, we stood beneath the courthouse, escorted by Holmes's quiet influence and a reluctant night watchman bribed into silence. The catacombs were dry, the stone unusually warm. Dust coated the skulls that lined the walls, each marked with the sign of the eye drawn in soot, blood, or chalk. "Someone has been preparing this for decades," Holmes muttered. "They wanted the public ceremony at the temple to fail. It was a distraction." We turned a final corner and saw them, 6 figures, robed in bone-colored linen, chanting in low guttural tones. In their center stood a 7th tall UNMOVING. Holmes froze. That's Sebastian Caro, he whispered. He disappeared in 1875. A former linguist turned occultist, declared dead. Of course, he founded this order. Caro's eyes opened. Holmes stepped forward. I suppose this is where I ask you to stop. The old man smiled. Can't stop what has already been sung into the stone. Holmes lifted the fragment of the first ether one, retrieved from the river, Caro hissed. The choir faltered. Ah, Holmes said, his voice ice. Still tied to it, are you? Even gods need anchors. He threw the shard to the ground and crushed it beneath his heel. The effect was immediate. A terrible scream, not human, reverberated through the ossuary. The choir clutched their heads. Caro convulsed. Holmes grabbed my arm. Run. The bones began to shake from the walls. A pulse of dark energy burst outward, extinguishing the lanterns as we fled. Behind us, the choir fell silent one by one. We emerged coughing into the cold air of night. The courthouse loomed above us, indifferent and stolid. Holmes stood hunched, breathless. It's done, I said. He shook his head. For now. That I was not the only one, Watson. But we've severed the right, interrupted the resonance. We returned home in silence. Over the next few days, there was no mention in the papers. No bodies found. No arrests. As if the city itself agreed to forget. Holmes sat quietly by the window. Something changed in you down there, I said. He didn't deny it. There are things that cannot be reasoned with, Watson. Powers that do not fear deduction. But they still require belief to thrive. And I choose not to believe in them. He stood and turned to me. But I will remember them and guard against them. He opened the drawer of his desk. Inside was a velvet pouch. He lifted it gently, then let it drop to the hearth. It shattered with a soft chime, the final sliver of the black eye. Let the world forget, he said, but not us.